Hi, everybody. Waiting to see if anybody is out there. Hi, one person. I'm going to be doing a couple things here. Oh, actually, I can do full screen, which is good. Good morning, Roberta. Thank you for joining. I'm going to give it a couple minutes so I can have some other people join, and then I'm going to start. Hey, Sebs. Help us search, make a better search for you. Yeah. Alicia or Alicia, how you doing? I had a friend named Alicia. She made sure we called her Alicia and not Alicia. Good morning. Good morning. Everybody, when you join, just go ahead and type in good morning so I can actually see how many people are with us. Um, Hopefully, everybody found the site okay. I added a link. If this is your first time watching me teach, hello and welcome. You are going to learn a lot today. We're going to pack everything into an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and I'm going to go over some seam finishes. So if you've never taken a class of mine or you've never watched any of my videos, I suggest you do two things. Grab a notebook and a pen to take some notes. And with your pen and notebook, what I need you to do, good morning, Connie. What I need you to do is if you have a question, write that question down. And then at the end of my session, we'll go through a Q&A, and I'll get to answer everybody's questions. Anything you've ever been wondering or something that you're not familiar with, you can ask at that time, because I'm going to be doing demos and showing examples of my demos. So it's going to be hard for me to watch the comments and to go back and forth. So what I like to do whenever I teach is make sure that at the end of the session, everybody gets a chance to ask a question. If there is a question and you see, of course, it's similar to yours or the same to yours, you don't need to ask the same question twice, right? So we're going to go through and I'm going to give it, let's start at like 10:05. Unfortunately, though, for everybody, the session I just found out is not going to be recorded. Good morning, Miss Deborah. How are you? I wish I could record it, but I can't record it. So that kind of stinky poo. Extra camera. Oh, extra camera. Well, there's nothing I can do with extra camera. I'm just looking at some of the goodies while some other people join us. Can everybody hear me okay? I just want to make sure that the sound is good and everybody can hear me. So let's just go ahead and type in, yes, we can hear you. Everything is okay. And I am broadcasting from my YouTube page and also out on wonderful. You can hear me also out on the Chicago Frog Tales webpage. So let me just go over what we're going to learn today. I'm trying to look for, hi, Adrian, how are you? I'm going to try and see if I can do something with this recording. We got to be able to record. And so I think in order for me to record, I may have to upgrade, or maybe they will save my broadcast. They better do something. I think they'll save my broadcast. I'm going to be confident in that. All right. So let me go over. We're going to go ahead and get started. So anybody who joins, hopefully they can catch the replay. Hopefully. All right. Well, anyway, here we go. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover seam finishes. We have tons of Frock Tales events coming up and across the country. Today is Atlanta Frock Tales, and next month is Chicago Frock Tales, which me and 8 other women are going to be hosting for those of you all who are going to be attending. So it was brought to my attention, why don't you do a seam finishes session so you can go over seam finishes. Maybe people are making dresses for the first time with fine fabrics, and they're not really sure about what to do and how to use different seam finishes. I thought that was a great idea, so I agreed to come on and help you guys out with your frock tail outfit, construction going forward. So a little bit about myself. I had a sewing business for about 12 years. I decided to close my business because sewing had become more work than fun, and sewing is my therapy. It's my passion. So I'm like, you know what? Let me get out of it before I decide I don't want to do it anymore. So I knew I wasn't going to not do it anymore, but it was becoming less and less, and I was not spending any time here in my sewing room. So I decided to go ahead and close my business. Now I only sew for myself. Every now and then I sew for my family when they acted right. But anyway, every now and then I sew for my family. And it's not that often, but pretty much sewing is all about me. It's all for me. And it's how I reward myself with peace, quiet, and new clothes. All right. And I've been sewing for a little over 25 years. So I have a lot of practice, a lot of experience, and I don't mind sharing my knowledge and my wisdom. Not only do I have these years, I've also been professionally trained as a tailor. I only tailor garments for myself. I don't do it for anybody else anymore. I did work for men exclusively for 4 years, making suits and doing alterations and that kind of thing. And I loved it. So, but like I said, I had to stop working and turn it back into fun. So what I'm going to share with you is not only a seam finish. Yeah, maybe you know how to do a French seam, but do you know why you're doing a French seam? And I've seen out there on their internets that people are using French seams just because they know how to do them. So I'm here to explain the finishes, the type of fabrics that that you should be using these seam finishes on. And of course, I'm going to demo how to do them. So here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to be going over a French seam. We're going to be going over the French seam with a large finish. We're going to be going over the French seam with a small finish. And then, of course, the why, and my demo, of course, is going to be the how. We're going to go over pink with a zigzag. Pinking shears with a zigzag is a great finish for a fine fabric, something slippery, something thin. So we'll go over that too as we get through it. We're going to be going over the Hong Kong seam finish. We're going to go over the faux fell seam finish, and then also a ribbon casing finish. If you're not familiar with the ribbon casing finish, today is May 4th. May the 4th be with you. You can see my little shirts got Darth Vader and Han Solo and C-3PO and Princess Leia and all this stuff. Yes, I'm a Star Wars geek, so I had to make my little shirt for Star Wars. This is a ribbon finish. I didn't have an example for ribbon seam finish, but I'm going to also show how to do a ribbon seam finish. And these can be done not only on sleeves. A ribbon seam finish can be done on a waist. It can be added to the front of the garment as a casing instead of you putting bias tape on the inside of a garment, making a casing. Why not put something pretty on the outside and make your casing? So this is also considered a seam finish. So we'll go over this and we'll go over the ribbon finish last. And I just thought, you know what, I'll add it because this is just something that I added to this shirt. It wasn't part of the pattern, But I just thought, this is a whole lot of look. I needed to figure out some way to balance and to break it up. So this was actually a part of the pattern. So I just didn't want to keep this in one fabric and not have it anywhere else. So I added as a ribbon finish. So we'll talk about this as well. This can be done with ribbon, and it can also be done with regular fabric. So going forward. All right, now okay, so this is interesting. All right, so now let's talk about the first. Okay, so we had a couple people join since I started. What you want to do is during the session that I'm going through, you can definitely get a notebook. You can take notes if you want. I want you to, in the end, write down any questions that you have. So in the end, we can do a Q&A session. So I can answer any questions. Like I said earlier, I am going to be doing some demos. So I want to make sure that I don't miss anybody's questions while we're going through the process. Not sure why my camera is changing. Yes, I am. My tablet is, I don't know. It's a little laxed. I pay money for fabric, not computer stuff. All right. So anyway, the first seam we're going to do is we're going to do a French seam. Okay. So now, actually, you know what? Let's flip the script here, because what I'm also going to cover are, I want to talk about fine fabrics, some ways to preserve fine fabrics, because we can go into the seam finishes. That'll be really quick. But I want to make sure that you all are having an understanding about fabrics and how to work with them when they're slippery, or when there's an issue and this, that, and the other. So and then I just got a thought. I'm like, as this goes and progresses, there's going to be more people joining and joining and joining. Let's just go ahead and let's do the seam finishes first, because I think the fabric information is going to be very relevant. And there's a lot of people out there that know how to do a French seam, but don't know anything about the fabrics that they're buying or the fabrics that they're using. So let's start with the fabric finishes. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to demo a French seam. Now, French seams have a little bit of math, whether or not you knew this or not. And I'm going to explain the math, and I'm going to explain the why. When I sew and I do French seams, I do two different types. I do a small finish, or I'll do a large finish on the French seam. So I got my little fabric here. Looks like you guys got a good view of my sewing machine. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do the French seam. Now, when you're sewing French seams, they're done with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance in mind, right? When you do your regular commercial pattern, or your PDF pattern, if it's not a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, it's usually a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we know we sew French seams with 2 stitches, right? The first stitch is 1/4 of an inch. The second stitch is 3/8 of an inch. So if you add 3/8 plus 2/8 equals 5. 3 plus 2 equals 5. So now we have our 5/8. You can also reverse it. You can sew 3/8 first, then you can sew the 2/8, which equals 5. And that gives you a smaller seam finish when you're done. Let me turn my iron on real quick, because ironing on, when you iron French seams, this is widely important. It's a step that a lot of people miss. And when you miss the ironing step, what happens is, yes, you have your French seam finish, but it's wavy, or the actual seam is pulled a little bit to the right, pulled a little bit to the left. And what happens when your seam is not perfectly straight? It'll cause the finished seam to wave, or it'll put curve. It'll also cause it to pull tight if you're using a fabric like satin or silk or something that's fine. We should see a nice flat seam just as if you are sewing cotton. So if you're not seeing that when your French seams are done, there's something that you're not doing. And usually the step that people skip is ironing. And I will show you the proper way to press a French seam before you actually install it. So let me go turn my iron on. Okay, guess what? My iron's already on, so that's a good thing. All right, so now we have to remember the math. 3 plus 2 equals 5. All right, and what I have in here is I have contrast and thread, so when I show you my examples, you'll be able to actually see the stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my French seam, starting with my very first seam as 3/8 of an inch. And that's generally, no, a quarter of an inch. So 3/8 of an inch. That's generally what we start off as. Okay, so with French seams, we want the finished seam to be on the inside of the garment. So you always start with the right sides out, or in sewing terms, it's wrong sides together. All right, so I'm going to do my wrong sides together, and I'm going to start with my 3 stitch. That's what I like to call it, because 3 plus 2 equals 5. Okay, I just did my 3 stitch, and you can see here it's in red, and I have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So what you need to do, I want you to save your questions for the end so I can answer all the questions at the end, and I'll give you the yes, the no's, and the whys. All right. So we have, and that's a very good question. Nobody has ever asked me that, so I would love to expound on that French seam question. All right, so we have our outside sewn, which is our 3, and most people just clip and flip, and then they sew the other seam. But what you need to do is when you first sew this very first seam, whether it's 3/8 of an inch or a quarter of an inch first, this needs to be pressed open and then pressed to the side. All right, I'm going to go do that right now. And I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by pressing the seam open. Now, you don't have to clap the seam, but it does need to be pressed open first. The reason why this needs to be pressed open first is because when you flip that French seam, you should not be maneuvering and feeling and doing everything trying to smash the seam. If you press it open first, what happens is the seams on the back are nice and flat. Okay, so now this is pressed open. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press it again. And another thing that's happening is when we press the seam open, the threads are being melded to the fabric. It's softening the fibers of the fabric as well. So depending on the type of fabric that you're using, it's getting acclimated to the fabrics. The stiffness of the thread and that core is being taken out. So now I'm going to press it to the side. Now, when I press this to the side, what's going to happen is now it'll be easy for me to trim the seam down, and I can just use my rotary cutter. So I'll be right back. Pressing it to the side or pressing it closed is all I did. Now I'm ready to trim my seam. So when I do my flip and stitch my 2/8 seam, I won't have anything hanging out on the other side. All right. I'm using, actually, let's bring you guys over to the ironing table. There we go. So now I just cut off the excess. Now I have a small seam allowance ready. Now I already pressed this open, clipped off the excess seam allowance. Now I'm ready to turn it to the wrong side, and I can press it closed. Now, sometimes I'll repress mine open again. And I'm going to do that on this fabric only because I'm working with cotton. And because I've pressed it before, it was just that simple to repress it open. Now I'm ready to fold my right sides together. Feel free to clap the second fold, which adds to the strength of the garment. Now, look at my French seam from the side. My seam is going perfectly vertical up my fabric. It's not leaning towards the right. It's not leaning towards the left. So now when I get ready to sew my 1/4 inch seam, I'll have a true 1/4 inch seam that I'm not going to be fiddling and fidgeting with as it goes under the seam, under the sewing machine, which is really important. That's another thing that'll cause distorted French seams whenever you're doing French seaming. All right, now I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam. It's easier for me to see the numbers on my stitch plate, which means that my seam is going to be foolproof. And you can sew faster. So a lot of people have slow sewing. They're a little concerned or confused about slow sewing. I'm a slow sewer, which means I am a stickler for technique. It doesn't mean that it takes forever for me to finish a garment. The reason why it takes forever for me to finish a garment because life be happening and I'm not 16 anymore. I have to attend to life. This is a luxury right now. So whenever you are doing regular sewing, when you follow these rules, you're not going to make mistakes, which will save you time. And then you can proceed forward with whatever it is you need to do. All right, so now I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I went ahead and I clipped my stitches. Worrying about whether or not there's going to be fabric coming through, that's another thing that will waste your time. Okay, so we need to make sure that we press the seam open so it'll be nice and flat. That gives us a nice flat surface or seam for our turn. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to clip that seam allowance down with, you can cut it with scissors, you can do it with a rotary cutter. And then when you do the flip to do your opposite seam, now we got a nice straight 1/4 inch seam, regardless of the fabric that you use, whether it's cotton, whether it's satin, whether it's silk, you'll have a nice straight seam as your finished product. Then what you need to do with your seams, and this is any seam that you have, you need to press it towards the back of the garment. What's nice about French seams is not only do they add stability to a garment. Let me press this. It's driving me bananas. Not only does it add stability to your fine garment, whether you're doing a lightweight cotton, like a cotton lawn or a cotton voile, or satin, which is a fabric that's slippery. What happens is it adds stability, but it also adds an invisible quality to the front of your garment. So you're not able to see the impression of the seams or seams impressions on the front of your garment. You could also take like a manila folder. I have pieces of manila folder that I put underneath the seam, and I press just so I don't have an imprint on the right side. But French seams are so soft and so delicate that you can press on top of them and you won't see the imprint going through the actual fabric. Okay. And you can see here for this is the 1/4 inch seam, which is the 1/4 inch finish. This seam here is much smaller. You can do it opposite. So your 1/4 of an inch seam first, trim it down, press it open, trim it down, flip the fabric, and then sew 3/8 of an inch. Now we have a larger finished seam. So if you want to do a fabric that's light to medium weight, like a quilter's cotton or maybe a chambray denim, and you want to do a seam finish, French seam, that's when you use it. When you have a 1/4 inch final, this is what you use on a chiffon, a cotton voile, cotton lawn, any type of one-ply silk, sand wash silk. These are done because these are catching the edge of fabrics that fray a lot. And it's also used on lightweight fabrics to keep a nice strong seam. You don't have to worry about it coming out or disturbing the seam as you go forward with care for the garment. Seam finishes, I do not recommend this French seam finish. I do not recommend for heavier fabric. Anything heavier than chambray, don't do it because it's just going to add bulk and it's not going to look nice. But remember the math. 1/2 inch stitch first with right sides together. Press open, press the side, close, then flip and press 2/8 of an inch. 3/8 plus 2/8 equals 5/8. And you'll be right on schedule with your pattern seam allowances. Don't forget to press that seam to the back of the garment because that is what finalizes your seam. Not only is it pressed to the back of the garment, you have an indicator now what the front and the back of the garment is, and you'll have a nice flat French seam on the front of your, or on the side seams or wherever. The best place to use a French seam would be on a sleeve, on a side seam. Okay. I was asked earlier, can you do a French seam on a princess seam? You can do it here, but I don't recommend it over the bust area. It's just going to cause bulk and it's going to cause a little bit distortion in the bust line. So if you want to use a French seam, you can clip right up under the bust where the princess starts to curve, and you can French seam from here down on the garment. Okay, but from the bust line or the bust curve up, I wouldn't recommend a French seam. Those seams have to be pressed open and then clipped so that the curve can relax and that it'll fit much nicer. Also, sometimes you have boning placed in there as well, but no, you don't need French seams on a princess seam. Okay, so now we're going to move forward. So don't forget, French seams can be done with the 3/8 of an inch seam as the final seam, medium, light to medium weight fabrics. And then when you have the 1/4 inch seam, those are for light to very lightweight fabrics. All right. Next seam finish we're going to cover is going to be the pinking with a zigzag. And this is a nice old school finish that works well with any weight fabric. It works especially well with fine fabrics because it is well, actually, it works especially well with all because the seams are pinked. You cannot see an impression, again, of the finished seam on the right side of the garment. So let me grab some fabric. All right. And what I'm going to do is I just have 2 pieces of fabric and I'm just using regular cotton. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stitch these together at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, I got my regular 5/8 of an inch seam allowance stitched in. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the seam open. Now this is a seam finish that you can do either. You can press the seam open and do each side of the seam allowance, or you can press the seams together and just do one side, one seam allowance. And I'm going to just press it together to do one. So again, I'm going to my machine, to my iron. I'm pressing my seam open to meld the thread into the fabric and to soften the fibers. When you press the thread, it's very important to relax the fibers of the garment. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my machine just to a regular zigzag. Now what happens in this teaches you how to top stitch as well. When you're stitching, what you want to do with this type of seam finish is you want to keep your presser foot to the edge of the seam that's currently stitched. And the same thing happens if you take the seam allowance and you want to press the seam open. Okay, so if you press the seam open, then the edge of your presser foot needs to ride up against this seam right here. Okay, so I got my machine set on a zigzag stitch, and what happens is when you keep your presser foot aligned with the seam, you are stitching now 1/4 of an inch away from the actual seam. Top stitching rule says when you top stitch, use the seam as a guide, and you're stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the actual seam itself. This is our 1/4 of an inch zigzag away from the actual seam here. And then the only thing you do to finish it off is you take your pink and shears and you pink the edge of the seam. Now, if you want to get closer and stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, because this is a seam finish, you can do that as well. And there's our pinked seam next to the zigzag and the straight seam finish. And then, of course, when you're done, the seam is to be pressed going toward the back of the garment. This is a seam finish that can be used on denim. It can also be used on silk. It's also a great seam finish to get used to doing if you do not own a serger, because this one right here is foolproof when it comes to washing and drying a garment, everyday wear and care. I have a pair of pajama pants that has the seam finish pre-serger days. Those pants are literally about 15 years old, and they're still going strong. My pinked edge has not frayed. It's not showing anywhere. My seams are nice and strong because they're reinforced with, not only do we have the seam, but we have the zigzag. Then that works. Another place where I use this seam quite a bit is in the center crotch of pants. You know how you need to cut out some of that excess? Sometimes what I'll do, depending on the type of slacks or whatever it is I'm making, I'll cut my seam down right there in that curved area that goes between the legs. I will stitch it because the stitch is already there. I'll go ahead and I'll zigzag that area, and then I'll pink that area. That's a great area to use this particular seam finish as well. If you haven't already serged. But me, myself, I don't like a full seam allowance in the crotch area of the pants that I make. I like my seam allowance to be a little bit closer so I'm not feeling it. So this is the seam finish that I use. And like I said, this is a great seam finish. Of course, if you don't have a serger, it's great for any type of fabrics, any type of fabric weight. It's really a nice finish to use if you're doing a fleece project, and your fleece project, you don't want to use, your sewing machine, or you're afraid it's going to get lost, the stitches will get lost. Make sure when you do a heavier project, you open the zigzag up so that it's wider. Of course, whenever you do a thicker fabric, you want to make sure that your stitch is also wider. And the wider stitches, not only for the ease of sewing, but if you make a mistake, they're much easier to pick out. Okay, this is the pinking shears and the zigzag with a regular 5-inch stitch. Great finish for fine fabrics, great finish for regular fabrics and heavyweight fabrics as well. This is probably a super universal stitch. All right, so let's move on to the next one. The Hong Kong seam finish. The Hong Kong seam finish has only 2 steps. No, 3 steps. And there's a difference between a Hong Kong seam finish and a binding seam finish, which I'll explain. Now, the Hong Kong seam finish requires that you use a piece of bias fabric. And the difference between the two is that the bias fabric in a Hong Kong seam finish is not folded. It's a single strip. So let me sew a 5/8 of an inch stitch here. Ooh, not a zigzag stitch. That's why you demo. Whenever you do a project, make sure that you take the scrap from the project that you're cutting out, set it by your machines, test all of your machines, and figure out what stitch or what stitch length the fabric likes. And then if you make a mistake or your machine jams, you got this piece of fabric to stick under here to correct your sewing machine, not your project. Don't stick your project under the machine when the stitches ain't doing right. That's just a little side tip. So you're always ready to stitch your project, regardless of how your machines are acting up, or if you forget to change a setting like I just did. Okay, so I got my Hong Kong seam finished. I got my 5/8 of an inch stitch. Now I'm just going to go press it open, and then we'll go forward. Now with the Hong Kong seam finish, you do not need to trim or clip or small your seam allowances. You're just working with a regular flat seam that's opened up, okay? So what you do is you take your little diagonal fabric, and you can see my bias, my little Star Wars guys are cut on the bias, right? So you take that and you stitch it to your fabric or to your seam allowance. And this one is actually kind of big. So what I do is I fold the fabric down, kind of like when you're inserting a zipper. We don't want to work with the fabric open because that's cumbersome. Get everything out of the way. So now only thing you have exposed for you to sew on is actually your bias strip and the actual seam itself. And you can do that on both sides. So I'm sewing here at 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to go, I'll go to the end of the strip. It doesn't matter. All right, so now what I'm doing is I'm sewing my bias strip on at 1/4 of an inch. Whenever you do Hong Kong finishes or Hong Kong seam finishes, these are good for thicker fabric. So if you're making a jacket to go over your pretty dress, we don't need a Hong Kong seam finish on the pretty dress, but we need a Hong Kong seam finish on that jacket because that jacket may be unlined. That's going with the fine dress that you're using. Hong Kong finishes can be used on fine fabrics or thinner fabrics. It can also be used on a fabric like sateen, but you only want to use it for maybe the center back of a jacket, maybe the sleeve of a jacket, because the seams can become very bulky to do complete construction on a garment. So you only want to use them on certain parts of the garment, maybe around a facing on a neck. You can do a Hong Kong seam finish. All right, so now we have the two stitched together. And then what you're going to do is you're going to press your seam towards your bias. Okay, and I'm going to go do that right now. This is what gives it that really nice, neat look. Hong Kong finishes can be done with contrasting fabrics. Me, myself, personally, I love a good Hong Kong finish using the fabric that your project is made out of. Then what you're going to do now is you're going to take that fabric and you're going to flip it over the actual seam. You're not going to clip it or clip the seam allowance or cut the seam allowance at all. You're just going to encase. Now we got it stitched together. Now we're just going to roll it over and we're going to stitch from the front side. And the best way to do is you can either pin this, repress it, or okay. And now what you're going to do is you can stitch in a ditch. But if you're not comfortable with stitching in a ditch, you can stitch on the actual tape itself. And I'll do both stitches for you just so you know, because some people are like, I don't stitch in the ditch. Well, I can't do that. It don't look right. That's okay. That is okay. All right, so we got that there. And then I even missed a couple stitches. So how about that? I'm going to actually show you guys this. Now, of course, when I miss a couple stitches, I go back in and I fix it. That is what slow sewing is. And then I'll also show you guys how to stitch close to the seam. And this is also acceptable when you have a Hong Kong finish. So now you can see, there we go. Now you can see here, this area here, where I try to do the stitch in the ditch, right? You can see I went off just a little bit like right there, but the rest of it is stitched in the ditch, okay? If you're having trouble stitching in the ditch, get you a foot. There's a foot that you can use, the ditch stitching foot, or you can use your blind hammer foot, which is the foot that has the little black blade on it, and then put the little black blade on the seam. And what happens is the needle follows the little black blade. As long as the black blade is in that little crease, you'll go right in the center there. Okay, here is the stitching just outside of the stitch. You can stitch on top of your bias tape, and that's fine, just as long as that underside is stitched down. That's what the goal is, okay? Then after you get it stitched down, you don't have to use pinking shears. You can use your regular scissors because bias fabric doesn't fray. Let me say that again. Bias fabric does not fray, okay? So now what you're going to do is you're going to trim off the excess, only if you got big pieces. I like to have big pieces. That's just how I am. Some people cut their bias strips, 1 inch or, 2 inches or however large they need them for the project. Then you don't have to worry about clipping it. All right. So you just clip it so that you can see some of your seam allowance here in the back. And then when it's pressed open, it lays nice and flat. So the difference between a bound seam and a Hong Kong finish is the Hong Kong finish seam. Let me go press this real quick so I can show you the finish. difference between a seam binding and a Hong Kong finish, and I'll do the binding seam next. There's the finish side. And then here's the actual seam itself done on one side. So what happens is the edge of the fabric is bound in the seam, but the underside lays flat. It doesn't have to be tacked or tucked or anything. You just fold it, you fold it over, and you keep this side flat. The reason why it's flat is to reduce bulk. The seam is encased, which is what the purpose is. The seam is encased, but now we still want that seam to lay flat. Now, if we had tucked that underneath, we'd have extra bulk. When you do a Hong Kong finish, the finish is flipped and it lays flat. You don't tuck it again. You just stitch in the ditch, or like I just showed you, you can stitch close to your ditch seam. Wait a minute, let me find, there we go. You can stitch close to the ditch seam as long as we are stitching down the underside of the fabric. And then you can go ahead and you can clip away the excess if you have excess. I'm just like all over the place with this. Okay, there's the underside. Okay, so like I said, for Hong Kong seam finishes, you can use them on fine fabrics, but it's easier to do French seam on a fine fabric. If you decide to use a Hong Kong finish, my advice would be to use it on the jacket that matches that dress. I don't recommend it on a cardigan because cardigan is usually made out of a knit fabric or very soft wool. If you add a stitch in the ditch seam finish, it's going to add too much structure and it'll stop the swing of the cardigan. So don't use these kind of finishes on garments that you want flowy. But when you have a jacket that matches a dress, you want some structure in the jacket. The dress may be slinky or maybe it's a slip dress. We don't need the structure there. So these are great finishes for toppers and additions to your outfit because they add structure and stop seams from looking ugly, and it's for garments that are unlined. Okay, and usually when we have a cute jacket that goes over a dress, it's unlined. Okay, and yes, serging the seams are always an option. Okay, now let's talk about bound seams. The only time I bind a seam is if I am sewing sequins. This is the best seam finish for sequins. Any other time, I do not bind seams. I don't do binding on seams. First of all, because it takes too much time. But if I'm going to spend the time on a garment completely made out of sequin, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bind the seam. There we go. Now that is slow sewing. Okay. And the reason why seam binding is great for sequin is because when you stitch sequin, if you're like me sometimes and don't feel like cutting sequins out of the seam allowance, although you're supposed to, y'all, I'm breaking the rules. I'm admitting I break the rules. I make sure I bind my seam because sometimes if those sequins are there in that seam allowance, they can be detrimental to your skin. They can scratch, they can do everything. So if you are using sequin fabric and you don't get just about everything, if you bind the seam, what happens with seam binding when you buy right seam binding from the store or you make your own seam binding, we're talking now about layers of fabric encasing that sequin. We don't have to worry about the sequins poking through and scratching your skin. So it's actually kind of like a little safety guard. This is kind of like a band-aid that goes over the seam allowance. Okay. And when you're doing sequins, you can bind each seam. So let me do my 5/8 of an inch seam, and we're acting like this is sequin. And here's a little did you know tip. If if you are working with baby sequins, which are the very small circle sequins, did you know that you can use baby sequins on your serger? Just make sure when you put it through the serger that you have a nice even pace. You don't want to sew too slow. You don't want to sew too fast. And um, the baby sequins actually will go through the serger. I would avoid using my blade to cut it. You can take the put the blade down or keep your fabric edge close to the edge so that it doesn't cut, and it just binds the actual seam in the end. That actually works. I have done that several times. And then if you want to finish that off with a seam binding, you can do that as well. But I have serged baby sequin, not the large stuff. The large stuff will kill your machine. Sequins will pop everywhere and you will definitely ruin your blade. All right, so here's my 5/8 of an inch seam. So let's act like it's open. I'm just going to finger crease this since it's cotton. And when you do a finger crease, make sure that you're creasing the actual seam itself. Don't, not this. It's not going to work if you're creasing the seam allowance. Crease the actual seam. And the finger creasing generally only works on cotton. All right, so you can take your seam binding and you can encase the edge. Open it up. And then literally you sandwich your seam allowance inside the seam binding. Now, when you're doing sequin, you don't have to bury all the way to the finished seam. So let me just show you what I mean. So you can even have it look that it appears like a Hong Kong finish. Okay. When we bind the seam, that just means that the seam binding is wrapping the actual seam allowance. Okay. And then we stitch on the edge or close to the fold of the actual seam. We do have the bulkiness there, but we're having a sequin garment, so you're not going to actually see the bulk. Okay. So you don't have to worry about the bulkiness of the garment. It's not an uncomfortable bulkiness. You're not even really going to notice it. But you do have the safety of the binding, keeping those sequins coming out and scratching your skin. And then also, this is good for the care of the garment going forward. All right. Then if you decide to encase both seam allowances, then you just sandwich the binding on the outside of the seam allowance, and then you stitch close to the edge. Remember, when you have a bias, binding, one edge is actually higher than the other edge. The higher edge goes on the back of the seam allowance. The lower edge goes on the front. So when you stitch, it's going to automatically catch that bottom one. So take a look at that when you take it out of the package. Don't just be throwing it around your seam and then hoping to God that you catch the other side. Seam binding is made so that one seam or one side actually sticks out. It's longer than the other side. So when you sew on this side, you're going to automatically catch this side. Take a look at it the next time you pull it out of the package. Just don't just pull it out of the package, throw the white piece away, put it around your seam allowance and have at it. I know some of y'all are doing that. Are you the guilty one? Yeah, that seam binding is actually made a special way. All right, let me put this off. We're going to show the red side. This is the big side. You can see the red seam. This is the side that was caught, right? And then now you can see the other side, which is much closer to the edge. Okay, so this is regular seam binding versus a Hong Kong finish or a Hong Kong seam finish. Okay, and then if you take a look at them, they actually look different. This one you can see more seam allowance, and then you see the edge bound in the Hong Kong finish, and then underneath is flat. It's just caught and cut off. And the seam binding is actually like a cocoon wrapped around the actual seam itself, stitched on both sides where you do one stitch. Yeah, when you do it incorrectly, you definitely learn. And then again, like I explained with everything, when you have a single stitch or a single seam, what do? We press it toward the back of the garment. Okay. Legs, arms, shirt gets pressed toward the back of the garment. All right. The next seam finish looks like we're going to go into 11:30, so an hour and a half. That's not bad. All right. So the next and final seam finish is going to be a faux fell seam. This is a wonderful seam to use on that beautiful jacket or that cardigan or whatever it is that you're going to overlay on over your beautiful dress. It's also a good seam to use on pants if you're doing slacks for the occasion. It's great for the outer or the inseam of pants. It's great for the underarm and the side seam of a shirt. I don't recommend it on a dress, but a shirt and pants, a jacket, or a cardigan, this is a good seam. The faux fell seam is one that I've used quite a bit. I've been sewing for a long time, y'all, and I used all of them quite a bit. I just thought about that. I'm like, you don't use that no more than any other seam you've done. All right, now with the faux fell, I'm going to stitch and those of you that joined a little late, yes, I have on a Star Wars shirt. May the 4th be with you. All right, I'm doing my 5/8 of an inch stitch. And I'm just stitching on the right side of the fabric because this is the way that I put it in the sewing machine. 5/8 of an inch stitch. Now, what do we do to the end of this stitch? We do something that we all love. We serge the ends of this stitches. I'm going to run these through the serger. Now, when I do a faux fell stitch, I'm going to take you guys over to the iron. When I do a faux fell stitch, I do not press my seams open. What you say? I do not press my seams open. I stitch the seam, and then I serge the seam. And then I press it. So after this stitch is stitched and the edge is serged, I will press my seam to one side. Now, when I press my seam to one side, I will take my fabric and lightly pull it. It needs to be lightly pulled so that the seam is touching the iron surface. What that does is that stops any little creases and folds right there at the seam. Give it a pull, and then you want to heat, add some steam, give it a pull, add some steam, and make sure you are pressing toward the back of the garment. If you're not sure what the back of the garment is, get that little marking pen out, that little marking crayon pencil or whatever, and put a B on the back side of the garment so you know what the front and the back of the garment is. All right. If you want to go ahead and press it on the right side of the fabric, you can go ahead and do that, but press in the direction of the seam. And what that does is that further stretches that seam open, so we have a nice flat seam. Okay, so now after we have that seam stitched and serged, we're going to press it on the right side so that it looks like a flat fell seam. Same strength, much faster, same stability as a flat fell seam. And then the flat fell seam rule is from the actual seam, we want to sew 1/4 of an inch from the actual seam itself. So I have my foot lined up. The seam is my guide. I have my 1/4 of an inch mark on my presser foot lined up with the seam. Now I'm ready to stitch. And then sometimes on a faux fell seam, depending on if I'm using a jacket, I'll open my stitch length up to 3. Because a top stitching finish, if you have a longer stitch, always look better. It looks better and it looks more professional. So you want to open up to the stitch length of 3. So now, on the right side of my fabric, it looks like a flat fell seam, correct? Everybody see that? You can see my top stitch is 1/4 of an inch from my main seam, right? And then you can also see that my stitch length is a little longer, so it's like nice and neat. But then when we go to the other side, now we can see that my faux fell is stitched down. I don't have to worry about this seam moving at all. This is a nice looking seam on the inside of a jacket. Like I said, it's also a nice sturdy seam for pants. Yes, this can be used on wool fabrics. As a matter of fact, I've used this finished on quite a few wool cardigans that I've done. If you're doing a wool coat, this is also a good finish, especially if you're not going to add a lining. It's a nice, neat, clean finish. And if you had contrasting serger thread, it looks even nice. I have a yellow jacket that's on my TikTok feed. This finish is in there. I use yellow serger thread, yellow stitching thread, and of course it's yellow wool. So it's a nice clean finish, and this washes really nicely as well. So if you're not that good with flat fell seams and you're making yourself some blue jeans or a cute little denim jacket, this is a great seam finish to use in place of that. This can be used on a finer fabric if you're making a jacket to match your dress. If you're making a jumpsuit, you can do this on the outer part of the sleeve. You can do this on the outer leg seam, not on the inner leg seam. You just want a regular stitch on the inner leg seam. But then you have the stability, and you can actually see how nice and stiff it's making the cotton. So this is a really nice, stable finish. It's a good looking inside seam finish for medium to heavyweight or light to medium weight jackets. You don't use a faux fell on a chiffon. It's way too much stitching and it's really not necessary. Okay. So we talked about faux fell stitches. And the reason why it's called faux fell, because it's faux, it's not a real flat fell stitch, but it resembles one and it adds the same properties as a flat fell stitch. Okay. Faux fell stitch involves your serger. Then we talked about the Hong Kong finish and how the Hong Kong finish needs to be clipped and flat on the underside. This is good for jackets and fancy garments that are not lined. Then we talked about binding for unlined garments, seam binding. It's also a perfect finish for sequin because sequin can't get through this and bite your skin, because on binding we have 2 layers. Double fold bias tape is another good thing to buy. If you're not going to make your own binding, double fold bias tape is what you want to get. The explanation of double fold means that there are 2 layers of fabric. It's folded once and then it's folded again. That's a double fold. Okay. Single folds have a really small seam allowance, and it's folded only one time. But when you do a double fold binding, it gives you more layers. That's why it's so good for sequin dresses, if you're going to do sequin dresses. And then where's my other? Here we go. My other seam finishes we talked about were pinking and the zigzag, the regular pink finish and the zigzag edge. This is a finish that you can use on any fine fabric. It's good if you do not own a serger. And the pinked edge also helps with show through. You do not have show through on the other side when you press your garment. Okay, all seams are to be pressed to the back of the garment. Okay, this is the pink with the zigzag. And then at the beginning, we talked about French seams. French seams are to be pressed to the back. First seam can be 2/8 of an inch, second seam 3/8 of an inch, or you can reverse it. First seam 3/8 of an inch, second seam 2/8 of an inch, which gives you a different finish. The 1/4 inch seam gives you a small finish, which is to me great for chiffon, organza, charmeuse, silk charmeuse, poly charmeuse, okay, because it gives you a smaller seam finish. If you do it opposite, where you do the 1/2 inch seam first, or the 1/4 inch seam first, and then the 3/8 of an inch seam second, you'll have a French seam for a heavier weight fabric. So you can go into raw silk, cotton, or cotton lawn, cotton voile. These are lightweight fabrics, but these are heavier than chiffon or organza. So you can choose the size of the finished seam that you want when you do your French seams. Just make sure that after you sew that first stitch with the wrong sides together, press it open, press it together, then clip your seam allowance with a rotary cutter or scissors. Press that seam open again and flip it so that your vertical seam that's getting ready to be encased is going nice straight up and down, and it's not wavy. And that makes all the difference on the outside of your finished French seam. Okay, so that's it for seam finishes. I just want to talk about a couple things before we go, when we go forward. And I'm going to move away from the sewing machine. And we're going to go over to my pressing table. Okay, now I wrote these down. So whenever you have fine fabric sewing and you're sewing organza or you're sewing chiffon, and let me pull out an example. Here's some organza, and here's some chiffon. When you're sewing chiffon, this is a very light drapey fabric. Organza is a little bit stiffer, right? But the thing about organza, it's a little bit easier to sew, but the control is not always there because the fabric, it's woven tighter. So it's you get a little nervous when you press it because you're like, okay, well, it's kind of bubbly. What do I do when I press it? The best thing to do for these fabrics is to spray them first. Now, they have stabilizers you can dip and starch that you can put all of that, you mix it up and dip your fabric in it. Then you got to wait for it to dry. I don't know about y'all, but I don't have time for that. Okay, I need to get this garment done, washed, and I need to wear it tonight, right? Niagara spray starch, old school spray starch. Best Press is also a good alternative to use. This one is my favorite. This one I use when I don't have no more of this, but you can see I have them both, right? This is like $1.29 at Walmart. This is like $9.99 or wherever, depending on where you pick this up. If you use a lot of it, you can get the gallon. If you don't use a lot, then just get the little spray bottle, okay? So let me show you how it changes the property of your fabric. And you can do this after you cut it. If you want to cut with the paper underneath, some people put paper underneath chiffon. That works well. It works well under silk. It stops the sliding of the fabric so that the cuts are even and that you have, you know, one square here and one square here, but not one square from the top and then the bottom is kind of going up on an angle. If you put craft paper or pattern paper underneath your fabric and you cut it out, it works wonders. And you can pin it. Don't put a whole lot of pins in your fabric. Just pin down the main points, which is probably be the corners of the hem, maybe right at the crotch. That's where you want to pin. So when you come through with your rotary cutter or your fabric or your scissors, you don't have to worry about your fabric moving or riding up like this. Okay. Now, what you want to do, I'm just going to take a small piece of the chiffon. Now you can see here, the fabric is nice and drapey, right? I take my Best Press and I'm just spraying the corner edge here. All you do is press it to dry. That's all you do. Sometimes I'll do this to my pieces after I cut them out. Now it's dry. Now, everybody see that? Look at that. It's not draping all over the place anymore. Now it's nice and stiff. Everybody see that stiffness there? That is so easy to control under your sewing machine. And all I had to do was spray it. So now let me take my piece and let me fold my little hem. See, look at this. Falling all off the table and all that crap. Let me take my little treated piece. Okay, I'm getting ready to hem it. Look at that crease. All from some Best Press. It's not sliding all over the place. Now I can control it. I can hem it. I can make a little small hem. Look at that. See how easy that is to control? Stiffen the fabric. When you're done with your garment and you're done with your construction, drop it in the washing machine on a delicate cycle with cold water. That washes all the chemical out. And then you hang it to dry. It's ready to go. Even with chiffon, you can spin it in the dryer for 5 minutes. Literally stand in front of the dryer 5 minutes, take it out, hang it up, and you're not even going to have to iron this garment. Okay, I've done it before. I've made jumpsuits out of chiffon. And everybody's like, jumpsuits out of chiffon. Yeah, when I discovered the stiffen, don't go nowhere and let me fold you up trick, I can make anything out of chiffon now. And it does not take me 5 hours. I'm not complaining. I'm not bitching about it. Take advantage of these. These are the best stiffeners out here on the market without buying all of that extra starch and all of that goopy stuff. Another thing I'm going to caution you against pressing without a silk organza. I know a lot of you use pressing cloths for your fine garments, but the problem with a cotton muslin is you can't see through it. Okay, you can see through the silk organza, and yes, it does make a difference. You need 100% silk organza. All you got to do is serge the edges. If you don't have a serger, pink the edges. Now, don't be going in right on the edge trying to save the fabric. Come in about an inch and then go ahead and pink all the way around if you don't have a serger. Okay, you can even zigzag the edges and then pink like that finish I just showed you. And you can use this for everything. If you double silk organza, 100% silk organza, you can iron sequin. It will not dull your sequin. It'll allow you to flatten your seams. and you can get a lot done. So those of you who saw my dress on Instagram, my red and black dress, I made that dress in 4 hours. It was a baby sequin project, so I was able to serge the seam allowances. I did bind some of them, and on the train on the back of the dress, I just covered the edge up with a binding. I just hand stitched the binding on. That whole garment was ironed with my silk organza pressing cloth, and not nowhere on that garment is there anywhere sequence that is dull. Okay. Thank you very much. But yes, and this is also good for ironing patterns. Anybody who's made pattern adjustments, say you want to make that last minute dress for frocktails, if you've done pattern adjustments and you got tape all over your pattern, cover this up and it's been folded and you're pulling that dress out, cover that pattern up with 100% silk organza, and you can iron right over the tape. It doesn't melt the tape. It won't scrunch the tape up. It just flattens out your pattern. So if you do not have one of these, go get you one of these. This is a straight up chicken salad. Okay. So what you need to do is get yourself like a half a yard of silk organza, 100% silk. Make sure it's white. Don't come home like all they had, Miss Carol, was navy. Don't do that to your clothes. Get you some white. Because if they're going to have any silk organza, it's going to be white or it's going to be cream. You can bring the off-white as well. And those of you that are using printed cotton as your pressing cloth, throw it out. Because what's going to happen is you're going to be getting ready for frocktails or your sister's wedding or whatever, and you're going to press, and all of that impression is going to come off on your garment. Whenever you use a pressing cloth for any garment, fine fabrics, regular fabrics, denim, it doesn't matter. Make sure it's white or it's muslin, which is beige, which means it's unbleached. Okay, you can use white or you can use unbleached muslin. I prefer 100% silk organza because you can do way more with it and it's transparent. You can see through it. You can see your seams. You can see what's folded. You can see where you need to press things out. So don't hinder your sewing experience. With these tools, we're making it better. Okay. Same things for organza. Definitely something I wanted to share with you all. Let me grab my book and let's see what else I did. Oh, and the last thing. Oh, goodness. Some things, this is something I want to let you guys know. Some other things to make sure that you keep in your sewing room arsenal. And I am out, which I am buying today. What I talked about, Best Press, which is great for taming silk organza. I'm sorry, not silk organza. It's great for taming chiffon, organza, regular poly organza, silk. This Best Press, I'm sorry, and then of course Niagara, whichever one you want to do. Just a little tip: when you use Niagara, make sure it's shook up very well, and keep the bottle kind of far so that it does a wide, even spray. Because when you get too close with Niagara, this is the old school stuff. Okay, you'll get a ton of starch in one area. We don't want that. We want a nice, even showered spray, and then give it about 2 seconds to soak into the fabric, and then go ahead and iron it. Don't be ironing that white bubble. You know, bubbles, don't iron those. Okay, let that soak into the fabric until you just see kind of like a wet area. Then you can go in with your iron and dry it, and it'll stiffen up really nice for you, and it'll be easy to control. Make sure you use the proper needle. When I was talking about keeping scraps from your cut project, if it's sequin, if it's silk, if it's cotton, if it's linen, take that piece and put it near your machines. What you want to do is you want to take that scrap piece, You want to serge it. Do you have the correct needles in your serger? Are the stitches even? Do I need to make any adjustments? This is something that I do religiously before I start my project. This is part of my project prep. Serge the edge. How does my serger like this fabric? Do I need to make any changes to the serger? Stitch. How many different stitches? Is it like the default stitch of 2.4? Is that too small? Do I need to open it up? Do I need to do this project at a 2.6? Do some stitches, do some testing. Feel the stitches with your fingers. If you feel bumps, your tension is probably a little off. It should be nice and smooth. The stitch should be nice and smooth, okay? This is very important when you're doing fine fabrics, because when you're working with fine fabrics, we paid a little bit more money, okay? So we want to make sure when we start this project that the end result is going to be what it is that we want, okay? So make sure you stitch and do the tests on your machine. I know you done sewed on Bertha every day, all day, but Bertha gonna be like, wait a minute, bitch, I ain't never seen that kind of fabric before. And you gonna be like, what's wrong with Bertha? Y'all know what we do. We blame it on the sewing machines. We never take accountability for it. So this is a way that you can be accountable. And you can blame Bertha for real. And she can say, well, girl, I'm sorry. I like a little bit bigger stitch. Work with me. So make sure you talk to your machines with the scrap. Keep the scrap near your machine. If Bertha don't want to act right and she's not feeling that bobbin and things are messing up on your project, take your project out. Use your scrap piece until the machine is stitching well, until you figured out what the issue is. Is it the spool thread? Is it the bobbin thread? Is my tension off? Then once we get some good stitches, now don't do that one stitch and be like, and then grab your project. 3 stitches is what you want to do. Bertha did good on that first one. Okay, bitch, let's go number 2. Go second stitch, third stitch. Then she's good. Grab your project and go ahead and finish. Okay? Don't do that one stitch and put your shit under there. Bertha be like, I told you my stomach still hurt. And then you be mad at her. And then you don't get your project done. And your husband or your significant other's like, when you going to be done? We're going to avoid all of that. Okay? We're going to get that project done. Right before it's time for you to walk out the door, you're going to be beautiful. Okay? So this right here, this stuff right here is very, very useful when you are doing your project. Keep a piece next to any machine that you're using, your serger, your cover stitch, your main sewing machine, even that backup machine that's got that white thread in there because you're using neon green, keep a piece there as well. Okay, very, very important. Hey, Rakaya. All right, so that's what you want to do when you're getting ready to sew these frock tail dresses and all this fancy stuff we're doing. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the ribbon casing. And you can see that here on the sleeve of my Star Wars shirt here. So this particular pattern is like Simplicity 9 something something. So whenever I do little fun stuff like this, I make sure I get like the simplest pattern so it's quick. I'm doing something quick, but I can, add a little fun fabric and make it fun for myself. Well, this little neck piece was already included because whoever made this here shirt realized that the V was a little bit big, right? So if you don't have this, when you lean over, it can gap open because it can be a little bit big. So this was actually part of the pattern, which keeps the shirt from gapping open. I thought this was kind of cool. So all I did was I just added some beads. I got some beads hanging on the back, and it's just loosely tied because I'm one of them people when something's on my neck or my head, I get a headache, but it's serving its purpose, right? So I decided, okay, well, I wanted to use an alternate fabric for my little neck strap. So what can I do to balance out the garment? So I just took some extra fabric and I made the ribbon seam casing. Okay. So this can be used with regular grosgrain ribbon or decorative ribbon. I just used a piece of fabric. I cut my fabric in like, I don't know, whatever this pattern piece was, maybe 1.5 or 2 inch. And then I folded in the edge. All you do is you take the fabric and you put, hold on, let me get the fabric here. There we go. Here's actually a piece of the fabric here. And then here's the shirt fabric that I cut on the bias for my bias example. The only thing I did was at the shirt bottom where the hem was, or any place that you're going to be using this, right? Whether it's as a waistband casing or an embellishment over the, at the bottom of a bodice before you connect the skirt. So it's about wherever you're going to use it. Make sure that this is the same width of that pattern piece, right? So what I did was I made sure that this was the same width as the bottom of the sleeve. And then after I did that, I took the bottom of the sleeve and I did right side to wrong side, right side to wrong side. That's all I did. And then after I stitched it, I was able to take it and flip it to the right side of the garment. And because I had this edge folded down already, then all I did was I stitched close to the edge. Okay, and like I said, you can do this with ribbon. You can use fabric. You can make it as wide as you want or as narrow as you want. And then it just gets attached to the unfinished seam. That's why it's a seam finish. And then when it's finished, you can see here, it's a nice clean finish. So this was just attached to the raw edge of my fabric, right side to wrong side, flipped up, and then stitched close to the top edge. And I used it as a casing. So I inserted my elastic and I stitched it down on the edge. Then I went on and completed my sleeve. Did the underarm seam and then stitched it to the armhole. And now this is done. The only thing I advise is it's going to leave a seam allowance, right? You want to make sure that you stitch the seam allowances down. And you can see here, I serged it. And to stabilize the elastic, I just zigzag the elastic down. And now I don't have to worry about the bottom peeking out or movement here at the bottom. Okay, so I do this a lot if I want to add a casing on the outside instead of casing on the inside, and I want to use something decorative. Great seam finish. You can use fabric, or like I said, you can use grosgrain ribbon. Grosgrain ribbon is a nice touch. It looks really nice when it's gathered. It's a nice, fun look. Okay, it is 11:28, and that concludes our seam finish lesson for your fine fabrics and our tips and tricks on working with some fine fabrics. I appreciate all of you coming out and watching me talk about what I love most, which is sewing. And if you don't follow me, you can follow me on Instagram at Ancy2001. You can follow my YouTube page, or you can join my Facebook group, which is Carol's Sewing Corner. And yeah, I'm always sharing tips and tricks all the time. My goal is to share my knowledge and all my years of sewing, what I know, and to make sure when I go out here on these here internets that your stuff is looking just as good as well. Slow down, enjoy the process, and y'all know what I'm going to say next. Let's make some real custom garments. All right, I got my mouse here. Y'all have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy your weekend. Oh, I didn't ask. Does anybody have any questions? I think I answered most of the questions that I saw. Thank you, Roberta. Anybody got a quick question they want to throw out there before we go? I think I got everything though. No, we're good. All right, you all. Have a good weekend. Thanks for joining me. Bye bye. Enjoy your Frogtails if you're going to Atlanta Frogtails. And if you're coming to Chicago next month, I will see you then. Have a good one. Bye, you guys.